The way that I pick a topic is I'm always puzzled by something. And so I see something taking place and I think, well, why is that taking place? And so my dissertation project came out of wondering why it is that members of Congress would ever do anything that would be against their own personal interests. So why is it that they would ever vote against a pay raise? Or why is it that they would ever vote to limit the number of terms that they could serve? And so I thought that there was a puzzle there that needed to be explained. And of course, it's not too difficult to come up with the explanation, which is their constituents want them to pursue those types of policies. And if they want to stay in office, then they need to pursue those types of policies. So in my more current work, the puzzle came from watching members of Congress in the House and in the Senate, and Democrats and Republicans fighting each other. The central research question that I'm trying to answer is trying to understand why it is that the Democrats today appear to be so liberal, so much more liberal than the Democrats of yesterday, and why the Republicans of today are so much more conservative than they were. So what is causing the parties to diverge ideologically? As soon as I recognized what the puzzle was that I was interested in solving, of course you have to come up with then steps to try and solve that puzzle. And so the first thing I wanted to do was document the trends and say, all right, so where were Democrats 30 years ago? Where were Republicans? And then how have they changed? And is it the fact that individual members are changing? Or is it the fact that member A is retiring and then member B is elected and they just happen to be more ideological than the people that they replaced? And so I needed to get kind of at the instrumental building block level to try and understand what was going on district by district, Congress by Congress, state by state, to understand why it is that the Democrats were becoming more liberal and the Republicans were becoming more conservative. And then once we have those building blocks established, it was necessary to reflect upon the data and to see if I could come up with any more systematic explanations. Is what's happening in California the same as it's happening in New York? Is what's happening in the 1970s the same thing that's happened in the 1980s? And so I was trying to come up with systematic trends or explanations that could explain not only what was happening 30 years ago, but also 20 years ago and 10 years ago and even last week. And so it was in reflecting upon the data that I tried to come up with systematic explanations for what has happened over the arc of the last 40 years in politics in the House and in the Senate. Right. The first step is that there's no doubt that members from the 1970s were replaced by more ideological members in the 1980s, and it was certainly happening in the South with the Southern Democrats who were being replaced by more conservative Republicans, but you also have the same type of trends happening in the North. So I knew that it couldn't just be a regional explanation or even just a constituency explanation, because what we also see is that the representative from Wyoming is much more conservative today than the representative from Wyoming was 30 years ago. And the same is true also in Delaware and Hawaii, which has 2 members of Congress. That we're seeing when even district lines don't change and even when the constituency doesn't change, we get a different type of member. And so that led me to wondering, well, is there something happening inside the Capitol, inside the House of Representatives, inside the Senate, that might be causing the parties to become more ideological over time? And so then I started examining the procedures that were taking place both inside the House and inside the Senate. And what we find is that the procedures that are being implemented by the majority party in the House and in between the parties in the Senate are becoming much more consequential. The number of amendments that can be offered is being severely restricted. The kinds of rules that are being implemented are much more carefully crafted so that certain members can't offer particular amendments. And so that led me to start evaluating and questioning if maybe the change in procedures wasn't leading the parties to look like they were being more extreme than they actually were. And sure enough, when we start looking at the procedures are both more consequential and they're much more divisive. So we see Democrats and Republicans, no doubt, disagree on major substantive issues, everything from the minimum wage to the budget deficit to taxes to engaging in wars in other countries. But they're even more at each other's throat when it comes down to the procedures by which they're going to be deciding those issues. And we see much more divergence we see much more homogeneity within party and much more heterogeneity between the parties. I think the existence of the blue dogs don't provide that much of a challenge to our current understanding of party polarization. Part of the reason that we only talk about the blue dog Democrats is because they are the only moderates currently in Congress today. And this is really a consequence of the 2006 and 2008 elections. Most of the moderate Republicans either retired or were defeated in the election. And so the only moderates today in the House are Democrats. I have no doubt that after the 2010 elections, if they go as badly for the Democrats as we think they're going to go, that there are going to be many more moderates in the Republican Party than there are today. And that's only a consequence of the number of Republicans that will be in the House and in the Senate. And so you're always going to have a set of folks in the middle. What's true about that set is it's shrunk over time. So while we're talking about these 15 or 20 members that were critical for the passage of health care reform, in the 1980s, it might have been 60 members that were critical. And so the president would have needed 40 of those 60, and in this particular instance, he needs 10 of 12 in order to pass. And so the number of people who can go to try and pass legislation is shrinking over time. So in thinking about what is surprising to me in my research and what is not surprising to me, I view kind of my data analysis as very much shining the light on where my future research is going. And so I'm surprised by every finding I have. And that very much structures how I'm ultimately going to argue what I'm going to argue. And so I don't ever like to hit the enter button on a computer and have it spit out numbers and me hope for a particular number to show up. So I can be unpleasantly surprised that that is the result instead of something else that I maybe was expecting as a result. So I'd rather kind of enter the enterprise without knowing where it was going and then seeing where the data lead me. When I started working on the project of party polarization, I never thought at the end of the day I would be talking about the procedural change inside the House and inside the Senate. It was only a consequence of the data that was driving me towards that answer that ultimately became the argument that I offer in the book. I think a valuable part of my research that speaks to the debates currently occurring in Congress is the debate that we just had over health care. There were several Republican leaders who said, basically we agree on 80% of the president's bill. It's trying to figure out that last 20% that's going to decide ultimately what the final shape of the legislation was. And of course, in the end, all the Republicans voted against it. And I think that is a major change that's occurring inside the House and the Senate. 80% would have been enough for Republicans to have supported the bill 30 years ago, and it's not enough today. And I think that's a consequence of the partisan warfare that they're having over the procedures. You'll remember at the when the president convened all of the leaders to come to the White House to talk about their issues with health care, the first thing that every Republican said is we need to scrap what happened and start over. And that isn't talking about the substance of the legislation, that's talking about the process, which indicated to me that it's very much a partisan, it's very much a procedural war going on Capitol Hill. And I'm not so certain that it's a substantive policy war that's occurring between the two parties. I think a real danger in doing political science research is a lot of times we try and make really broad claims based on the data that we're presented with, and we try and say have grand theories that we have evidence for. And the danger always is that next week there's going to be an issue, and someone's going to say that issue doesn't fit your data. And so what we know about party polarization is the polarization is different on different sorts of issues. So an issue like healthcare reform, where you have lots of interest groups lining up with the Democrats and lots of different and opposed interest groups lining up with Republicans, it's a natural issue where there would be lots of partisanship. But on an issue like financial reform, where you have lots of Wall Street people backing the Democrats, lots of Wall Street people backing the Republicans, it's generally going to be easier for them to reach some type of consensus. Because at the end of the day, no politician is going to want to claim that they're protecting Wall Street against Main Street. And so it's just a harder issue in which to demonize your opponents, or for the demonization of your opponents to have any credibility. My current work is going to pick up with the party polarization question. I feel at this point I've answered some easy questions, and now I'm ready to start answering some really difficult questions. And I think the most difficult question is really how different are the parties on the actual substance of the bills. And the reason that that's so difficult is because maybe in comparison, it's really easy to understand or to evaluate how different they are on procedures because they cast these votes on procedures, and so it's really easy to measure and count and sort those. But when it comes to the substance, it's really hard to kind of get at, all right, so what does the average Democrat think about healthcare? And what does the average Republican think about healthcare? And how has that difference on healthcare changed since the 1970s? And has the difference between the two parties grown? Or is it just the fact that the parties now are fighting in an agenda that generally has more consensus? And so the last few details that are yet to be worked out are the ones that they're digging in their heels on, and they're refusing to grant the other side any type of leeway. And so my next question is going to be trying to get at really the differences between what Democrats believe and what Republicans believe on the actual substance of the legislation. The way that I learned how to read was that my sister was interested in presidents, and so we had lots of president books laying around the house. And so the way I learned to read is I would sit on my mom's lap, and she would read a one-page biography of George Washington, and then I would read a one-page biography of John Adams, and then she would read the one-page on Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and Monroe, all the way through the book. And so even today, I've kept all those books. So I have like 100 books of the presidents for children. And so my interest in politics extends back to when I was 3, 4, 5 years old. And I've always been interested in politics straight through. I've never lost that interest in politics. And so when I was an undergraduate, I thought that I would go and get a real degree. And so I was an accounting major. And that lasted for all of one semester as I was taking my Intro to American Government class and my Intro to Accounting. And there was no doubt that my passions, my interests, and everything else were with the American Government class. And so it was silly for me to continue the charade of thinking that I needed the real degree when my passion and my interest was in politics. I actually think that the burden is on us as teachers to instill a fire in them and a passion for politics. We get one chance. And what they learn in your class then carries over into how they practice their politics for the next 40, 50, 60, 70 years. And so I think that it's instrumental that they take this class. They learn about the framework by which we can analyze politics. And then in any political situation in which they're faced, or they have to evaluate candidates or issues or positions, they can fall back on the framework that we provide for them in this class. And then they can be an intelligent consumer of politics rather than a passive or an unengaged voter.